One of the most inspiring voices of our times, Greta Thunberg!
There is no planet blah, 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 blah.
One of the most inspiring voices,
Blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. That means we will have to change. What do we want? When do we want it?
How do activists and politicians persuade people? Which tactics do they use? And how do we become proficient at identifying them? With one of Greta Thunberg's speeches as an example, these are the questions this video will answer. First, I'll introduce a macro-level framework that we can use to understand speeches in general. Then I'll introduce micro-level persuasion tactics that Thunberg uses. All tactics are aimed at persuading the skeptic and affirming the believer, same as in most speeches. Roman Jakobsen's communication model explains every element and entity involved in a communication process, whether we're talking advertising, political speeches, movies, songs, etc. I'll quickly explain the concepts that are most relevant for the purposes of this video. In terms of factors, the communication process or persuasion process starts with an addresser who has a message he or she wants to sell to an addressee, that's us, the audience. We interpret the message in a context as we look at what's being spoken of and what's being referred to. These factors have functions linked to them. The so-called emotive function is linked to the addresser. What's the tone? Is the addresser happy, serious, formal, informal, ironic, etc.? The cognitive function is linked to the addressee. What does the addresser want the addressee to do or become? The referential function is linked to context. What does the message specifically refer to? Which information is conveyed? And how is this information related to the current zeitgeist? Here, it's easy to see how Thunberg's message is inextricably linked to the zeitgeist, while simultaneously creating the zeitgeist, deciding what we hear about in the media on a daily basis. The poetic function is linked to the message and has to do with the specific rhetorical figures and tropes with which the addresser tries to persuade the addressee with his or her context-specific message. The emotive function in Thunberg's speech is characterized by mainly two discourses that work together to form her message. One, frustration with the way things are going, and two, optimism, in case politicians and people take her advice. As part of the optimism discourse, she often smiles and seems easygoing. This brings levity to a message that's serious. The two discourses are present right from the beginning. Notice the words threat and opportunity respectively. Threat is associated with frustration, and opportunity is associated with optimism. Let's watch.
Climate change is not only a threat, it is above all an opportunity to create a healthier, greener and cleaner planet which will benefit all of us. We must seize this opportunity. We can achieve a win-win in both ecological conservation and high-quality development.
With the pronoun we, she's already speaking on behalf of an audience, presupposing that this audience is on her side and that it even exists. The speech wouldn't have the same effect if she had said, I must seize this opportunity. This way of presupposing an audience and demanding things on behalf of it is called constitutive rhetoric, because she's literally constituting an audience which might not exist in real life. Another thing worth noting is the absence of details. The link between the conservation she advocates for and high-quality development isn't particularly obvious. Absence of details is a standard part of the vast majority of political and ideological speeches. Aside from being convenient for the speaker, fewer details lead to fewer things to disagree about, and less disagreement makes persuasion easier. Next, notice the positive terms that Thunberg uses to underline the optimism discourse, including the new management term, innovation.
Fighting climate change calls for innovation, cooperation and willpower to make the changes that the world needs. We need to walk the talk. If we do this together, we can do this. We must find a smooth transition towards a low-carbon economy.
CEOs often overuse this word because it makes them seem in touch with their target audience, even though the truth is often very different.
You know, we have the ability to recruit amazing talent, and we're very deliberate about it in terms of who we bring in, and with that, we put innovation front and center. And we wouldn't be here if innovation wasn't front and center. We weren't good at innovating, and then there's no chance that we would be still here today.
What was clear to me is that if that adherence or the reverence that people had within the company for that heritage continued, it would get in the way of innovation. And so I started articulating in the succession process the need to balance heritage with innovation.
To make the changes, walk the talk, smooth transition.
Looking at the cognitive function, what is it that Thunberg wants the constituted audience to become? She wants them to become allies in making changes, a word she has yet to specify the implications of, as well as what a smooth transition entails. Looking at the poetic function, walk the talk is an idiom, which implies the existence of the opposite without her having to say it explicitly, that too many people only talk. Next, she continues with a conversational discourse designed to connect with the audience she's constituted in an informal fashion. And the poetic function continues with an episusis, which is a repetition of a word or a phrase in quick succession to hopefully increase its impact and memorability.
When I say climate change, what do you think of? I think of jobs. Green jobs. Green jobs.
Did I mention that she wants jobs to be green? Many times politicians overdo this repetition, including this Prime Minister.
Would it have been worse if we hadn't lifted a million people out of poverty? Would it have been worse if we hadn't created a million jobs? Would it be worse? Would it be worse? Would it be worse?
The same Prime Minister who gave an equally unspecific speech about the same subject. Please remember to clap along.
Andrew Scheer wants to scrap the first and only national climate plan Canada has ever had, and we will always do more to fight climate change.
So far, Thunberg's speech has been characterized by optimism. However, she can't hide a characteristic way of expressing her frustration forever. And that's exactly why she started with optimism. Optimism lets the audience, and especially critics, see new sides of the speaker, that he or she can do more than just complain. Speech initial complaining will make many people tune out. Next, prepare yourself for the longest 40 seconds of your life. Hang in there and remember what we've learned. If we do this together, we can do this. Did I mention we can do this? We can do this.
There is no planet B. There is no planet blah, 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 blah. This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah.
I must say, I could have used just one more example, because I'm not quite sure I get it yet. What's ironic is that this speech hasn't been any more specific than the leaders she parodies. In fact, just before this passage, she said green jobs without offering any context. Saying green jobs isn't different from saying green economy.
Green jobs, green jobs, green economy, blah, blah, blah.
So at best, this is self-parody, and at worst, and more likely, it's inconsistency on full display. Because Thunberg's speech hasn't been any more detailed than the superficial words of the leaders she criticizes, it undermines her subsequent talk about these leaders' empty rhetoric.
This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. This is all we hear.
Again, the speech wouldn't have the same feel to it if she had said, "This is all I hear," or "my hopes and dreams." That's how we know constitutive rhetoric is at play. Maybe she's learned from past experiences.
I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
Our hopes and dreams drown.
The verb drowns marks a maritime metaphor. In speeches, the function of metaphors is to dramatize the speech, and with this dramatization, make it more engaging. I'll leave it up to you to decide if it works. Here, aside from the identified optimism and frustration discourses, Thunberg creates an us and them discourse, and thus a protagonist-antagonist framework, which is a standard part of political rhetoric.
Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us?
But what kind of dialogue is she actually interested in? Because with the conjunction but, which marks a contrast, she minimizes or negates the part about dialogue. In other words, there's a mismatch between what she says she wants and the syntax with which she expresses what she allegedly wants.
Over 50% of all our CO2 emissions have occurred since 1990, and a third since 2005.
In political rhetoric, it's well known that numbers are invoked to authenticate the speaker's narrative. Numbers have a way of impressing and shocking people, and most importantly, giving the impression that the speaker is competent and authoritative. The thing about numbers, though, is that they're most often ambiguous, dependent on a variety of independent variables. Thus, the numbers can be interpreted in many different ways, and speakers unsurprisingly interpret the numbers in ways that benefit their cause. Numbers are frequently used to tell stories of decline and create the illusion that a very complex and ambiguous phenomenon is simple, countable, and precisely defined, both of which seems to be the case here, given the complete lack of the complex, multifaceted solutions she would have to present in order to solve the complex, multifaceted problem she's referring to. Thunberg speaks as if the solutions are self-evident, simply based on the numbers she presents. So this is covert argumentation as opposed to overt argumentation. Overt argumentation is when the speaker defines the presuppositions. We don't get any of that. What we get is more of the same frustration discourse, with a hint of the optimism discourse.
All this while the media is reporting on what the leaders say that they are going to do, instead of what they are actually doing. And then not holding leaders accountable for their action, or rather inaction. And don't get me wrong, we can still do this. Change is not only possible, but urgently necessary, but not if we go on like today. But not if we go on like today.
This last sentence is why intentional vagueness is an academic concept. Not if we go on like today, she says, without mentioning the specific and wide-ranging consequences of her visions. Why doesn't she talk about consequences? What people would have to live with and without? What her propositions would mean for businesses in every city, in every country?
They say they want solutions. But you cannot solve a crisis that you do not fully understand. You cannot balance a budget if you do not count all the numbers. 2021 is currently projected to experience the second highest emission rise ever. Global emissions are expected to rise by 16% by 2030.
Here we see another aspect of the poetic function, effective prosody. With her micropauses, visible anger and vowel stresses, she's playing on the audience's indignation.
The second highest emission rise ever. By 16%. But you cannot solve a crisis that you do not fully understand. You cannot balance a budget if you do not count all the numbers.
She's criticizing other people for not fully understanding the crisis and not counting all the numbers. So does that mean that she fully understands the crisis and has counted all the numbers and considered every aspect of it? If that's the implicit claim, which it appears to be, it's as self-overestimating as it's unrealistic. The talk about decline reminds me of another aspect of political rhetoric, causes. What's caused the decline? There's an interesting distinction between intentional causes and accidental causes. In her speech, Thunberg strongly implies an intentional cause, which is the most powerful offensive position to take, because it lays the blame directly at someone's feet. Problems or harms are understood as direct consequences of willful human action, or inaction.
Action, or rather inaction.
An intentional cause is in opposition to an accidental cause, which could be nature or the weather that human action can't do much or anything to change. The rhetoric in speeches is most often dominated by intentional causes, and the reason for this is twofold. One, if a crisis is caused by willful human action, then it follows that it can be solved by willful human action, which is the reason for Thunberg's constitutive rhetoric in the first place. Two, the consequences of willful human action open the doors for stories about oppressors and victim narratives create pathos, and pathos is an effective appeal to people's emotion and pity. Pathos is an effective persuasion tactic. And next, as she mentions oppressors and victims, we see the pathos appeal in full action. The next clip exposes the belief system behind Thunberg's visions.
And the climate crisis is, of course, only a symptom of a much larger crisis. A sustainability crisis, a social crisis, a crisis of inequality that dates back to colonialism and beyond. A crisis based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to exploit and steal other people's land and resources. And it is very naive to believe that we can solve this crisis without confronting the roots of it. It is very naive.
Of course, and naive, she says assertively, appealing to alleged shared knowledge that the connection between the crisis and the past is this simple, one-dimensional and unambiguously bad. The purpose of the shared knowledge technique is to avoid objections, as if there's no other way of looking at it than the way the speaker's looking at it.
A crisis of inequality.
Also, inequality compared to what? Because she doesn't ground her claims properly. There isn't enough information to justify generalizations of this magnitude. At this point, she's merely saying words that people are going to have an instinctive emotional response to, kind of like when the leaders she criticizes speak. What she's doing here is similar to a bait-and-switch tactic, because she went from talking about emissions to talking about colonialism, using an oversimplified and loaded verb like steal in the process, which contradicts that she's only speaking factually. Never mind that big and small companies also create jobs, making it possible for people to survive. So the overall question becomes, what is actually naive?
And it is very naive.
Are other people just naive? Or could the problem be that this speech is naive? Because she hasn't properly argued for these supposed roots of the problem. And interestingly, she hasn't said what confronting the roots of the problem will mean for the average citizen.
Confronting the roots of it.
Confronting the roots is as vague and ambiguous as it gets. And ambiguity is the glue of politics. It allows people to agree on laws and policies because they can read different meanings into the words.
Our leaders' intentional lack of action is a betrayal towards all present and future generations.
What's been heavily implied is now out in the open, intentional causes, right out of the handbook of political rhetoric.
The people in power cannot claim that they are trying, because they are clearly not, as they continue opening up brand new coal mines, oil fields and pipelines.
This is called a synecdoche, a small part of a problem that's used to represent the whole. Here it's coal mines, oil fields and pipelines. However, it doesn't follow, as she tries to make it seem, that just because there are coal mines, oil fields and pipelines, they aren't trying. People's lives depend on these things. Also, it's quite convenient to talk about the problems without coming up with a detailed solution on how to quite literally change the way the entire world is working, from each and every country's economy to each individual family's way of life.
They are clearly not listening to us, and they never have. Just look at the numbers. Look at the statistics. The emissions are still rising. The science doesn't lie. Just look at the numbers.
Yes, because numbers don't lie, right? I mean, it's not like politicians use numbers, oftentimes the same numbers, to their advantage. Here, Thunberg unintentionally reveals why numbers are used in argumentation to appear authoritative and create the illusion that a very complex phenomenon is simple and countable. She appeals to science as if science is an animate and pure entity.
The science doesn't lie.
People do science. Science doesn't do itself. Rarely is science something objective you can go out and discover. People do analyses and make estimations, and aside from the fact that these analyses and estimations hinge on a number of independent variables, they aren't always devoid of political interests and lobby groups either. Next, she's about to address the consequences that her visions will have for people. Notice the intentionally vague and ambiguous way she does it.
But, of course, we can still turn this around. It is entirely possible. It will take drastic annual emission cuts, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone can deliver anything close to that, that means we will have to change.
Yes, that definitely sounds entirely possible. I'm totally buying this return of the optimism discourse. Now I see how truly solid it was and is. Change. What should change? And which technological solutions? Ironically, the lack of specificity is identical to the words of the people she's speaking against, or is pretending to speak against, politicians.
Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action.
The exact action she hasn't presented, and the truth she hasn't properly defined or made arguments for. If argumentation is simply presenting negative numbers without presenting independent variables and considering the good initiatives and outcomes as well, it's not argumentation at all, and it sure isn't truth-seeking. Next, she continues to say we, because saying I is much too lonely.
And we the people, we want a safe future. We want real climate action and we want climate justice. Did you hear me? What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! The leaders like to say, we can do this.
Which she literally said in the beginning.
If we do this together, we can do this.
With this vague speech, it seems that she has more in common with the people she condemns or pretends to condemn than she'd like. The battle cries don't make things any better, or any less lonely for that matter.
Again, what do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
What do we want? I'd say that depends on your perspective, because all I want is for the speech to end. What do we want? We want to click the like button and subscribe for more videos, obviously. See you next time.